Hello again, and welcome back to Algebra 2 Notes with Miss Faust. Today we are going to look at solving quadratic equations by completing the square. Just a heads up, this is something that most people struggle with, so it's definitely something you should be patient with yourself about. It's going to take a while, take some practice. It's not difficult, it just takes a lot of steps. So we'll go through it step by step. I'll give you lots of chances in class and here in the notes to see how this works, and hopefully pretty soon you'll be feeling pretty comfortable with it, but just be patient with yourself, okay? So the idea that we're going to start looking at now is how we can solve any quadratic equation. So when we get into quadratic equations, we've already solved some that didn't have a middle term using square roots. The problem is when we get into, and I should probably write this here, when we get into more complicated quadratic equations that look like that have this middle term, we can't just take a square root to solve anymore. So one of the things that we can do is we can do what we call completing the square. So today's notes are going to go over how you solve by completing the square. And what you want to start by doing is just pause the video here and copy down these steps. There's 5 steps here, and I'll give you a minute to copy them down. Well, I'll ask you to pause to copy them down, and then I'll talk you through them. So just copy them first, and then I'll talk through the understanding of them. Okay, so hopefully you just paused and came back, and now you've written these down, and let's just talk a little bit about them. So step 1 is to rewrite your equation in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So the idea is you want just your x squared and your x term on one side and all your other terms on the other. That's going to be the first thing you want to do. The next thing you want to do is you want to find b, because b is what we're going to use when we're completing the square. So b is the coefficient of x. So b is going to be this number right in front of x always. And what we want to do is we want to take that b value and divide it by 2. So we're going to get some number. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 12 divided by 2 would be 6. Whatever it is. So you take that b over 2 and now you square it. If your b over 2 is 6, when you square 6, you'd get 36. Whatever that number is, you add to both sides of your equation. And adding it to both sides is important. That way we're keeping the equation the same on both sides. Now, once you do that, one side of your equation will look something like this. X squared plus something, x plus something equals, and then on the other side you'll have, whoops, 2 numbers. That should just represent a number. X squared plus something, x plus something equals something plus something. This side we can factor, and we will be able to factor it because of these steps. And this side you'll just add the numbers together. That'll give you a perfect square equation, and you'll solve that using reverse order of operations, or SAD-MERP. Sounds a little bit complicated at first. Once you start seeing some examples though, I hope that it will start making sense. So let's go on and let's start looking at some examples. Example 1 I have, we have x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0. So step 1 is to rewrite without this 1 in it. So in order to do that, we're going to subtract 1 on both sides. I'm just going to annotate this a little bit so you can connect it to your notes. And we get x squared plus 6x equals negative 1. Okay, so that's our step 1. Step 2 is find b. So in this case, our b is this 6. So what I want to do is I want to take that 6, which is our b is equal to 6. I want to divide that by 2. b divided by 2 gives me 3. And then I want to square that number. So b over 2 squared equals 3 squared, or 9. This 9 is what I'm going to add to both sides of my equation. So let me just write that down here. I have x squared plus 6x. I'm going to add 9 here, and I'm going to add 9 here. So that plus 9 is going on both sides. And this is, let's just see, this was step 2. This is step 3. And this is also part of step 3, adding that 9 to both sides. So now we take a look at this. And when we look at this side, we have a trinomial, an x squared, a 6x, and a 9. And hopefully when you look at that, you think to yourself, I wonder if there's two things that multiply to 9 and add to 6. Well, here's the best news about completing the square. There's always going to be something that multiplies to this and adds to this. Not only is there going to be something, that thing is going to be, trying to get another pen, that thing is going to be this number from step 2. So what I can do, this side of my equation, I rewrite as x plus 3 squared. And that 3 again, I'll underline it in pink, just like the pink over there. So that 3 is coming from here. You don't even really have to think about it if you remember what b over 2 is. And the reason that that works is if you think about multiplying out x plus 3 times x plus 3, you'd get x squared, you'd get 3x twice, which gives you 6x, and 3 squared gives you 9. So we get x plus 3 squared equals negative 1 plus 9 is 8. So that's step 4. And now we use inverse order of operations to solve this. So if we have x plus 3 squared equals 8, notice here the squared is outside the parentheses. So we have to get rid of that squared first. So let me just rewrite it so that you can really see which step is which. So in order to get rid of that squared, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And I'm going to get x plus 3 equals whatever the square root of 8 is. And let me do that real quick. Probably should have used a number that came out even, but that's okay. So when I do that on the calculator, I get 2.83. I'm going to make that a positive 2.83, but I'm also going to remember that when I take a square root, I can have a negative answer. So this is all part of step 5, TEP 5, and remembering that square roots have 2 answers. Answers? No, answers. I seem to be having some trouble writing today, but that's okay. It's small. You can barely see it anyway. Just kidding. X plus 3 equals 2.83, or x plus 3 equals negative 2.83, again, because that square root can have 2 answers. So now we just add 3, and add 3, and add 3, and add 3. And when we do that, we get x equals 5.83. That one I can do in my head. And over here we get x equals negative 2.83 plus 3, which is 0.17. So the completing the square part of this comes in all the way up here to step 4. Once you get to step 4, you've completed the square. And then these equations are something that if you took Algebra 1, you definitely solved them before, or if you took integration, you would have solved those before. But I know it's been a while, so it might take a little bit of time to get used to doing that again. But the completing the square stops right here. And then this is just solving using inverse operations again. Okay, any questions? Just kidding, I can't hear you. Write your questions in the margin, and then I can answer them in class next time. Meanwhile, I will go on to example 2. Adjust, adjust, adjust. Perfect. X squared plus 3x plus 17 equals 0. So again, we want to start by getting our x squared and 3x by themselves on one side. So I'm going to subtract 17 on both sides. And I get x squared plus 3x equals negative 17. That was step 1. Now I need to find b. b is the coefficient of x, so b is equal to 3. I need to divide that by 2. 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. I've now finished step 2, and now I need to do b divided by 2 squared. So I do 1.5 squared. And 1.5 squared is 2.25. So this 2.25 is what I'm going to add to both sides of my equation. So I come back over here, I do x squared plus 3x plus 2.25 equals negative 17 plus 2.25. And at that point, I can, at that point I need to factor this side. So at first you're like, aw, geez, Miss Faust, I don't know two things that multiply to 2.25 and add to 3. But the good news is, remember, this number, this b over 2, that's the number that when you multiply it twice you get 2.25, and when you add it to itself you get 3. So that tells us how we can factor this as a perfect square. So x plus 1.5, and again that 1.5 comes from up here, right? I know you can't see pink that well, but I'm using it on purpose for emphasis. 1.5, and then we do negative 17 plus 2.25 on the other side, and we get negative 14.75. At this point, we've completed the square. Now we need to solve this equation. So again, we think about inverse order of operations. Parentheses are stuck together, so we need to take the square root first. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. On this side, I will get x plus 1.5. And I don't need the parentheses now because I don't have anything outside of them, so I don't have to write them again. And that's equal to the square root of negative 14.75. So I have to keep going now. Notice here we get this negative. That just means that our answer is going to be an imaginary number. So really this is the same as the square root of 14.75 times the square root of negative 1. But we know the square root of negative 1 is I, the letter I. So we get x plus 1.5, and we still have two possible answers because the square root of 14.75 can still be positive or it can be negative. And the square root of 14.75 is 3.84. So over here I'm going to put 3.84i, and over here I'm going to put negative 3.84i. Now all we have to do is subtract 1.5. And in some ways this is even easier than the last one because that 1.5 is a real number. The 3.84i is an imaginary number. So when I combine those, I get negative 1.5 plus 3.84i, or negative 1.5 plus 3.84i. Not plus, minus. Oh man, this one, sorry about that. I got too excited. I thought I got to turn the page. This one shouldn't be plus, this should be minus 3.84i. So notice that the answer is just one has a plus and one has a minus in it. Okay, like I said, maybe easier because you don't actually have to type anything into the calculator, but those would be the two solutions to that equation. I'm going to do two more examples. At this point, if you feel like you're like totally good with this and you want to just stop, I get that. My suggestion would actually be to write down the example, try a couple steps on your own, and maybe go through the video a little at a time to follow the steps, and then try the next step on your own and the next step and the next step and see how you do. That way you can also figure out where you're stuck, and that way when you come to class next time, I can help you get unstuck. Okay, so going on to example 3. Here we have example 3. So in example 3 we have x squared minus 8x minus 20 equals 0. So our first step is to move this 20. So we subtract 20 on both sides and we get x squared minus 8x equals negative 20. You know what? I'm going to change that. Why did I subtract 20? Man, I'm having all kinds of mistakes today. That should be a positive 20. Positive 20. Whew, there we go. Now we want to identify our b. So b in this case, watch out because we have a negative. So b is negative 8, which means b over 2 is negative 4. And b over 2 squared, or negative 4 squared, is positive 16. So I've got those numbers now, so I can say x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals 20 plus 16. And the reason I have to add those on both sides is because if I change one side of an equation, in order to keep things equal or balanced, which this tells us we have to do, we have to add the same thing on the other side. Otherwise, we would end up with something over here that was 16 more than this, and then that won't solve the original equation we had. So whatever we do to one side, we have to always do to the other as well. Now we want to look at factoring this side. So two things that multiply to 16 and add to -8. Well, luckily, we already know that it's -4. So we write x minus 4 squared, and 20 plus 16 is 36. Then we want to solve that equation. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. Can't decide how many pens to use and when today. Okay, so x minus 4 equals the square root of 36. Well, the square root of 36 is either 6 or -6. So I say x minus 4 equals 6 or x minus 4 equals -6. Now I just solve those. So I add 4 and I get x equals 10, and I add 4 and I get x equals -2. So as you can see, sometimes we get real answers, sometimes we get imaginary answers, sometimes we get decimals, sometimes we don't. It just depends on the problem we're doing. Okay, I'm going to do one more. I'm just trying to pick a good one. I like that one. So example 4. And again, at this point, if you want to try it on your own first and then jump into the video or try a step at a time, all of those are really good strategies. Whoops. Really good strategies for using these videos to help you learn, not just to copy down as much as you can. And that is my goal, is for you to learn from these. I know, shocker, right? She actually wants us to learn something. Okay, sorry, I'm back. X squared plus 16x equals 24. We've already got the 24 on the other side, so we don't need to worry about that step. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with step 2. We're going to find b. b is 16. b over 2 then is 8, because 16 divided by 2 is 8. b over 2 squared is 8 squared. 8 squared is 64. So I come back to my problem. I start with x squared plus 16x. 64 is what I want to add to both sides. Both sides so that I keep things even. I look at this side. I think about what perfect square gives me a 64 and a 16, and I remember that it comes from right here, so it's this 8x plus 8. And again, you can think about that by thinking 8 times 8 is 64, 8 plus 8 is 16, so we know that's going to work. 24 plus 64 is what, 88? 64 plus 24, I'd try and do it in my head, but I'm not having much luck with that these days. Today, I mean. So it is 88. Now we've completed the square. We take the square root of both sides. We get x plus 8 equals something positive, and x plus 8 equals something negative. And those somethings are 9.38 and -9.38. I just did the square root of 88 on my calculator. Now, plus 8, so I minus 8, so I minus 8, so I minus 8, so I minus 8. Subtract 8. I know, I shouldn't say that on video. 9.38 minus 8 equals 1.38. Minus is like the operation when you read it in this sentence, but subtract is what you're actually doing. Complicated, right? You thought my job was easy? Ha! X equals -17.38. So our two solutions are 1.38 and -17.38. Hopefully you've had a little luck with figuring out how this whole completing the square thing works. As I said, the more we do it, the easier it will get. And you will also find it super, 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 super helpful when we want to start graphing quadratic functions. So just a little preview, that's what's coming soon. After we do the quadratic formula next time, then we will be all set to graph. So thank you very much again for your attention. I hope you had fun and you have a wonderful day. Ciao.